So, this week we're going to talk about school finance and CLB and a lot of the technical aspects of big impact policies in a contemporary framework. Now, school finance, first of all, really very much has to be understood as deeply connected to desegregation and to economic inequality in public schools and in broader society. Therefore, it's a very ideological aspect of education and one that's extremely political. And that makes it very difficult to figure out, especially if you're doing research in school finance. It makes it very difficult to figure out what's a legitimate piece of scholarship and what's something that is kind of just advocating for a particular political standpoint and manipulating data accordingly. We'll talk about that later, but the key idea here is that it's a very political and ideologically driven aspect of public schools, and something that's always very much intertwined with racial and economic inequality. So, first, when we talk about school finance at a very basic level, we should understand that finance has always been a huge part of public schools and a key concern for many of the ways in which public schools have organized themselves and established themselves as institutions and as systems. Even going back all the way to Horace Mann, we can recognize that this idea of efficiency and standardization were very much tied to cost as much as to just effective educational processes. And that a lot of times when we hear words like efficiency or standardization, that is part of the school system that's targeting low-income sectors of society. In other words, wealthy children are much less likely to have a very standardized education or to have an education whose emphasis is mainly on this idea of efficiency. Instead, it's more likely that they will have more heterogeneous opportunities, that they will have a very individualized experience, that there will be resources available to differentiate experiences. So that's one thing to kind of keep in mind. That since the beginning of schools as a system, there's always been this tension over who's going to pay for it, how much are we going to pay for it, and it really depends on who's in the school, whether or not I as a citizen am willing to pay for it. In other words, I may perceive the population benefiting from my tax dollars as a population I do not want to contribute to, and that often very much influences people's attitudes towards whether or not they're willing to support public schools. So this is one of the ways in which finance very much ties into desegregation, because we can see that when the demographics of public school students shift dramatically towards more low-income students or towards more students of color, like today, that there's a lot of white flight as a response. There's a lot of unwillingness to increase resources for public schools. There's also a lot of pushing for other options to leave regular public schools and avoid those student populations, particularly on the part of white middle class consumers in this educational marketplace. So that's where you start to see things like charters becoming really popular. And we'll get into that later. But the point is that there's a lot of relationship between who's going to benefit and whether the general public is willing to pay. Also because what their perceptions are of the people being supported by public institutions. So if we have the stereotype, like in Freedom Riders, for example, of students of color or low-income students as educationally disinterested or incapable, then people may feel that it's a waste of money, that until you change the values or behaviors of those students, that it's not the institution's fault, it's those people's fault. And why should we waste money on changing something that's not the institution's fault? So in that sense, racialized ideology, negative ideologies that target the poor, become a rationale for not increasing resources. And that becomes extremely problematic because quite often it's the lack of resources that's created this problem in the first place, that it is an institutional problem. So we see that people use ideology to defend the institution or to eliminate it from consideration as a cause. And then they rationalize the ability to not have to pay more for something that they've decided is beyond their control. So even from that, we can see this happening in Wisconsin right now. We can see that there are huge struggles over the budget, and that these struggles are very ideological in their basis. Some people are saying we shouldn't have to pay for this. This is not a public responsibility. And from that, there's this idea that individuals should protect individual benefits, that we shouldn't necessarily be responsible for contributing to the public good as citizens. Instead, we should be individual beneficiaries or consumers. And we see other people arguing, no, there is a social contract. There is a public responsibility, and that we should all be contributing to this public responsibility. So even in our own state, we can see that it's not just a dispassionate analysis of what costs what and what is the most effective for children. It's a very ideologically driven conversation. So what we're going to do with this school finance conversation first is I'm going to just kind of walk you through real basic aspects of how do finance formulas work, who decides them, what is the process, and then we're going to get back into explaining the ideology and recognizing some of the major arguments that scholars and policymakers have put forth for and against school finance reform. So at a very basic level, we already talked about the first part of it, but in addition to desegregation, school finance often is very much tied to other issues that we may not always consider. For example, standardized testing. One of the things we can see with NCLB is that the more flexibility you have financially, the less under the gun you are for NCLB. And what that means is that quite often you have a bit more leeway in how much you have to teach to the test. How much you're able to maintain a high quality enriched curricula, or are you really pressured to narrow your curricula to fit what's going to be on the standardized test? So resources play a very strong role in that negotiation. The other thing is in highly qualified teachers. Clearly, the people who are the most desirable candidates for a teaching position are going to have more choices in terms of where they work. And it makes a lot of sense that people who have a lot of options will choose to go places with really good working conditions, with smaller class sizes, with less pressure to teach to the test, and with a better salary. So if you are in a low-income district that can't afford to have small class sizes, that can't afford to have updated facilities or updated technology, that can't afford a competitive salary, that puts you at a real disadvantage in terms of the recruitment and the retention of a high quality teaching force. Another aspect of finance that is kind of related to this is with teacher unions. A lot of times people have a strong feeling against teacher unions if they perceive teacher unions as very costly or as a threat to economic efficiency. We already kind of talked about class size, but basically finance influences class size in a couple different ways. One is in terms of being able to pay for personnel. Do you have enough money to have one teacher for every 15 or 20 students, or can you only afford to pay for enough teachers for 1:30 ratios? So obviously that makes a big difference. The other part is in the money for facilities. If you do lower class sizes, where are you going to put these extra classes? Do you have enough money to expand your building to house all of these extra classes and these new personnel? So those are just a couple ways in which that ties in. And then the last part is just all the extra, not extra, but what people often perceive as extra. So for example, under NCLB, we can see that people who are very strapped for resources often eliminate things like art or theater or music or even social studies as a way to save money and still meet the requirements of the standardized test. So the more resources you have, the more options you have in terms of your curriculum, your personnel, your class size, your facilities, all of that. So in terms of just figuring out how does school finance work, this is an example of a general formula. Usually the federal contribution is around 9–10%. It really depends on all of the different programs or lines of funding that you would be eligible for in the state, at the district level, and in your school. So for example, if you're in a school with a very high population of students who are eligible for free or reduced lunch or for Title I funding, your federal contribution may be a bit higher than a really wealthy district that doesn't have a lot of students who would fall into those categories of eligibility. In general, also, although there's a lot of variance for this, the state would contribute around 40–45%, and then the local would make up the other. This example here is just an example of what would be a more balanced finance formula. The idea here is that the more you rely on the local, as you can see in this next one, the more unequal your finance formula is going to be. The reason why is because local relies on property wealth in the really small community. So what that means in practical terms is that if the majority of your money comes from there, it's possible that you could be a very wealthy district and generate a lot of resources by even taxing yourself at a very low rate. Whereas if you are a low-income district, you may even tax yourself at a higher level than wealthy districts do, taking a bigger percent of your income towards the schools, but you still wouldn't generate as much because you don't have as much wealth to tax. So when you rely more on state funding, that tends to equal things out because you have more guaranteed source of revenue and a guaranteed amount. So in Wisconsin, for example, our formula, we have what's called equalization aid. And so what that means is that our formula looks more like this. But for local districts who are not able to generate the revenue that they would need to get to a certain amount, then the state uses equalization aid to fill in that gap. So what the state does is it sets a cap in terms of per pupil expenditure, and it says, okay, you can only spend up to $9,000 per student in your district, and that's for the state as a whole. So if you're able to get to that through this regular formula right here, then you don't get any extra equalization aid. But let's say between this 45 and 45% split, you're only able to get to $8,500. Then the state would use equalization aid to contribute a bit more and make sure that your district is up to that $9,000. So one of the kind of big turning points in making school finance such a contentious political issue is San Antonio versus Rodriguez. This is a court case that happened during that general backlash against desegregation enforcement in the early 70s. And this case had many important implications. So it's a good idea to just understand the logic behind this, and that should help understand some of the politics of desegregation as well as the politics of school finance. So just as with desegregation court cases, this case also was brought under the 14th Amendment and this idea of equal protection. And the facts of the case basically said, we are being unevenly targeted by the finance formula because of the way that this formula creates a disparate impact on low-income communities. So Rodriguez, they're the plaintiffs. It's a low-income Mexican-American community, and they said, you know, in Texas, here's how the formula works. There are two sources of primary funding. Local property tax, and then just a really low minimum foundational contribution from the state. In other words, the majority of the money is coming from the local. Now, there's a couple different aspects to that. One is the tax burden the community imposes, meaning how heavily do they tax themselves. And then the other part is, what is the property wealth? Meaning, how much overall is it possible to tax? So we had talked about this just a little bit ago, where it's possible, if you have a lot of property wealth, to have a very low tax burden, but still generate a high level of resources. Similarly, it's possible to have a very high tax burden, but low property wealth and generate few resources, even though you're taxing yourself at a higher rate. And that's exactly the situation that this Mexican American community found itself in. It was taxing itself at a much higher rate, but still receiving less resources than wealthier community. So the plaintiffs argued that this violated equal protection under the 14th Amendment. And the U.S. District seemed very friendly to their argument. Their argument was basically that this law is unequally impacting us, and it's not a fair law. And they use strict scrutiny, which is the tightest form of scrutiny you can use when analyzing a 14th Amendment case. And so basically what they were looking for is to see, is there a compelling interest? Meaning, is there a interest that's so important that it would make it okay to discriminate against some people through the law? And then the other part is that they were arguing that there was a suspect category involved. And they were saying that wealth is a suspect category. So this was kind of a tricky sticking point, because usually wealth had not ever been considered a suspect category. However, because the district court accepted those two ideas, that there is a fundamental interest in public education and that wealth was a suspect category, the court put the burden of proof on the state of Texas. And what they said was that the state needed to show a compelling interest that was so important that this formula would be considered legitimate. However, since the state of Texas was not able to argue effectively about a compelling interest, a really, really important interest, they ended up losing the case. So the district court held that there was an equal protection violation here, that the level of the funding for a public school district should not be a function of wealth at the local level. It should only be a reflection of wealth for the state as a whole. However, Texas appealed this, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court. And at the Supreme Court, the big difference was that they refused to apply strict scrutiny. In other words, they refused to say that wealth was a suspect category, and they refused to put the burden of proof on the state of Texas. So the wealth part was particularly important, because they were saying there's really no direct evidence that wealth, family income, and race were connected. They're saying there's a relationship, but you can't really show us a direct causal relationship where it's always the same no matter where you go and how you look at it. So the complexity of that relationship basically took it off the table. If they would have been able to make it a lot simpler and just argued something like, if you're poor, you will always have a bad school, they may have had a better shot. But since there was difficulty in arguing that here, they took it off the table. The other thing is that they refused to recognize public education as a fundamental right. Because there's no place in the U.S. Constitution that guarantees you a right to a public education, they said that it's important, but it's not fundamental. It's not like freedom of speech or freedom of religion or something like that. So without that strict scrutiny, it was very easy for the state of Texas to create a different rationale for why they should be able to keep this formula. And therefore, the Supreme Court upheld that and allowed them to do it. So there are some important factors in this decision, and the implications are also with us today. These factors and the implications both are still relevant. So the implications first. Rodriguez basically said, first of all, that the U.S. Constitution does not protect your right to a public education. It's at the state level. So if your state constitution says we will offer a free public education, then you have protections under the law. But that's if your state chooses to offer public education. And even then, your legal protection only goes to the state level, not to the federal level. In other words, there's a lot of limits on the protections of your rights in that scenario. The other thing it did was it relegated questions of school finance legitimacy to the state level as well. And so what that means is that state by state, each state legislature will decide on the formula and implement it in that way. So we can see the repercussions of that now, where every state has a different finance formula, and we often are very uneven in our finance equity depending on what state you're in. There's no coherence amongst the states. Okay. So some of the factors in the court's decision that we still have to understand is that, one, the court was skeptical that disparities in expenditures and disparities in resources was actually damaging to students. They were also skeptical that the state contribution and this bare minimum was inadequate. And then kind of the key reason why those first two things held true is because of this strong stereotype that money won't matter for particular students. And this is where we get into this kind of cultural deficiency belief that ties back to natural law, that ties back into a lot of attitudes that we saw Du Bois addressing, that we can see from the desegregation literature. So in other words, if you have this deeply held belief that people are poor because of bad decisions, because of poor values, because of blah, 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 or that racial and cultural communities are fundamentally different in their behaviors or their values or their work ethic, and that's why they're marginalized, then you have individualized what is a systemic problem, and you're assuming that the system or the institution is neutral and fair, and that it's the people who are making inappropriate choices, and that's why they're unequal. So if you have this assumption that some children's parents just don't care, or some communities are just lazy, or whatever, then money doesn't matter. Then it is a change in values. So again, we can see that in Freedom Riders, where we don't fundamentally adjust the resources in the community or in the district. We adjust the values and belief systems of the students, and that is what is their ticket to success. Okay? So if you accept that belief, if you accept that narrative, it becomes a very powerful rationale for maintaining the status quo, for legitimizing the institution as is, and for negating any right to additional resources or expenditures. And one of the biggest sources of so-called evidence for this standpoint was social science research. The court kind of picked certain arguments from scholars and said that because it's scientific, this becomes an appropriate form of evidence, and that we're going to use this to justify this decision. So from that standpoint, we can also see that cult of experts that we briefly touched on in Chapter 5 of Tozer, that idea that if you have a PhD, if you engage in a certain process of knowledge, that somehow legitimizes that knowledge.